Every single human civilization that has ever existed has done drugs, no exceptions. The ancient Sumerians, the Greeks, the Aztecs, medieval monks, Victorian housewives, your grandmother. People have been hunting for ways to alter their consciousness since before they had writing, before they had agriculture, possibly before they were fully anatomically modern human. And the story of how we got from a prehistoric shaman huffing smoke in a cave to a Bayer pharmaceutical rep cheerfully marketing heroin as a children's cough suppressant is one of the most genuinely wild rides in all of history. This is not a story about moral failure or weakness. It is a story about curiosity, medicine, commerce, empire, and the very human desire to feel something different for a while. The history of drugs is also the history of civilization itself, and it starts a lot earlier than you think. The original trip. About 13,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Algeria, someone mixed a pigment from minerals and painted a mushroom on a cave wall. The Tassili cave paintings in Algeria depict what appear to be anthropomorphic figures covered in or associated with mushrooms. Researchers date these images to between 7,000 and 9,000 years old, and some scholars argue they represent some of the earliest evidence of psychedelic use in human history. Whether that specific painting proves mushroom use or just mushroom reverence, we will never know for certain, but the broader picture of prehistoric drug use is well established. Archaeological evidence from across Asia shows cannabis seeds appearing in dig sites dating to around 8,100 BC. Coca leaves were being chewed in South America from at least 6,000 BC, which means humans were getting a mild cocaine buzz roughly 4,000 years before the wheel was invented in Mesopotamia. Not that anyone was complaining about the lack of wheels at that point. They had other things going on. The current scientific understanding is that psychoactive plant use is not some aberration in human behavior. Evolutionary biologist Nick Longrich and others have argued that altering consciousness was essentially a species norm so widespread across cultures and time periods that labeling it deviant requires ignoring thousands of years of human behavior, which, to be fair, humans are very good at doing. The evidence gets richer as we move into recorded history, and it almost immediately gets ridiculous. The joy plant and the Sumerians. Around 3,400 BC, the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia were the first civilization to leave written records of drug cultivation. They called the opium poppy Hulgil, which translates roughly to joy plant. And you have to give them credit for honesty in branding. No pharma company in history has been that straightforward about its product. The Sumerians cultivated poppies in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From there, knowledge of the plant passed to the Assyrians, then to the Babylonians, then to the Egyptians, spreading through the ancient world along trade routes that doubled as pharmaceutical supply chains. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text from around 1550 BC, contains prescriptions involving opium. One recipe recommended giving crying infants a preparation of poppy to make them cease their crying immediately and forever. Reading that sentence requires a moment to sit with. The ancient Egyptians were not casually poisoning babies, to be clear. Infant mortality was catastrophic in the ancient world, and the logic of quieting a sick child in pain made practical sense to people with no other options. But the line between medicinal and recreational use of opium blurred early and stayed blurry. By the time the Greeks and Romans got involved, opium was medicine, religious tool, recreational substance, and poison weapon all at once. Homer mentions a drug called Nepenthe in the Odyssey, described as something that puts grief and sorrow to sleep. Scholars have debated for centuries what Nepenthe actually was, but opium is the leading candidate. If ancient Greeks were self-medicating their post-Trojan War trauma with opiates, well, that is a very human response to very bad events. Cannabis gets an ancient medical license. Around 2700 BC, the legendary Chinese emperor Shen Neng reportedly prescribed cannabis tea for conditions including rheumatism, malaria, gout, and what the texts vaguely describe as absent-mindedness. Whether Shen Neng was a real person or a mythologized figure is debated, but the Chinese medical use of cannabis is historically documented, and the Shenong Ben Chao Jing, a foundational Chinese pharmacological text, treats cannabis as legitimate medicine. In ancient India, cannabis had both medicinal and spiritual roles. The Vedic texts, some of the oldest religious writings in the world, reference a sacred drink called soma, whose exact composition has been debated for over a century. Some researchers believe soma was a preparation containing cannabis. Others argue for fly agaric mushrooms, ephedra, or various other plants. The honest answer is nobody knows, and the priests who made it apparently kept their recipe extremely well guarded. What is clear is that cannabis use spread from Central Asia outward across the ancient world, carried by the Scythian nomads, traded along the Silk Road, adopted into religious practice by Hindus, Zoroastrians, and eventually, Sufi Muslims. The plant was so universally useful, so easy to grow, and so reliably effective at altering mood and perception that virtually every civilization it encountered adopted it in some form. It is genuinely funny that for most of human history, cannabis was considered a mundane and practical plant, roughly equivalent to how we think of aspirin, and it took the 20th century to reclassify it as one of the most dangerous substances on Earth. History has a sense of humor, even when legislators do not. Scythians at the steam bath. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described a Scythian funeral ritual that reads more like a fraternity hazing than a religious ceremony. After burying their dead, the Scythians would build a small tent, place a dish of red-hot stones inside, and throw hemp seeds onto the coals. Then they would get inside and breathe the vapor until, in Herodotus's words, they howled with pleasure. For a long time, historians were not entirely sure whether to believe Herodotus on this one. He is not always reliable. The man also wrote about ants the size of foxes guarding gold in India, so his credibility has limits. But in the 1940s, excavations of Scythian burial mounds in the Altai Mountains of Russia and Kazakhstan uncovered bronze censers, hemp seeds, and small tents, exactly as described. The archaeological record confirmed what had looked like exaggeration. The Scythians were doing exactly what Herodotus said they were doing. The Scythians were also, incidentally, some of the most effective mounted warriors in the ancient world. So, the next time someone tells you that drugs make people useless, you can point to a culture of skilled, feared, nomadic warriors who apparently had a ritualized hotbox ceremony as part of their religious practice. Context matters. Cannabis was probably reaching ancient Greece and the Mediterranean through Scythian trade routes, which means the next entry in this story might not be entirely coincidental. The Greeks drank something extremely interesting. Every year for roughly 2,000 years, tens of thousands of ancient Greeks made a pilgrimage to the town of Eleusis, near Athens, to participate in a religious ceremony called the Eleusinian Mysteries. The ceremonies were sacred to the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, and they were kept so secret that initiates faced the death penalty for revealing what happened inside. For 2 millennia, barely anyone talked. What we know is that participants drank a special ritual beverage called kykeon, described in ancient texts as a mixture of water, barley, and pennyroyal mint. And then, by all accounts, they had experiences so profound and transformative that multiple ancient writers described the mysteries as the most significant event of their lives. Sophocles called participants fortunate. Cicero wrote that Athens had given humanity nothing greater than the mysteries. Pindar described the initiate as blessed because he has seen these things. In 1978, classical scholar Carl Ruck, psychedelics researcher Albert Hoffman, who actually synthesized LSD, and philosopher Gordon Wasson proposed in a book called The Road to Eleusis that the kykeon was psychoactive. Specifically, they argued it contained ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains alkaloids closely related to LSD. Recent archaeological work at a site associated with the mysteries in Spain found traces of ergot in a chalice and between the teeth of a human jawbone, adding some physical evidence to a hypothesis that remains contested but no longer seems crazy. If the Eleusinian Mysteries were essentially an ergot trip supervised by priests, then 2,000 years of Greek civilization and much of the philosophical tradition of Western thought was being partially shaped by people having chemically induced mystical experiences. Socrates was an initiate, so was Marcus Aurelius. This information does something interesting to how you read Plato. The Americas had their own whole thing going. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mesoamerica in the 16th century, they found something that genuinely unsettled them: a thriving drug culture embedded entirely within religious practice, and significantly more sophisticated than anything they had left behind in Europe. The Aztecs called psilocybin mushrooms teonanacatl, which translates to flesh of the gods. These mushrooms were consumed at major religious ceremonies, coronations, and festivals, primarily by priests and nobility as a means of divine communication. Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún documented their use in the 16th century, describing ceremonies where the mushrooms were eaten at dawn with honey, and participants reportedly wept, had visions, and communed with supernatural beings. The Catholic Church, unsurprisingly, declared this absolutely unacceptable and attempted to suppress it. The practice went underground but never fully disappeared. Peyote, the small cactus containing mescaline, had been used by indigenous cultures in northern Mexico and the southwestern United States for at least 5,000 years. Aztec priests used it for divination. The Huichol people consider it sacred to this day. Archaeological evidence of peyote use in Texas dates to roughly 3,700 years ago, making it one of the oldest confirmed psychedelic rituals in the Americas. The coca leaf was not cocaine, not in the way we think of cocaine today. It was a mild stimulant used across the Andes for thousands of years, providing energy at altitude, suppressing hunger and cold, and playing a central role in religious and social rituals. Inca priests chewed coca while communicating with deities. Laborers chewed it to get through grueling agricultural work at high altitude. It was, essentially, the sacred energy drink of a civilization that built Machu Picchu. What the Europeans would eventually do to it was something else entirely. Tobacco, meanwhile, gets overlooked as a drug because we have largely desacralized it into a simple addiction product. But in pre-Columbian North America, tobacco was a highly psychoactive substance used in concentrated forms during shamanic ceremonies, sometimes smoked in quantities large enough to induce hallucinations and out-of-body experiences. When European colonists got hold of it and started using milder varieties recreationally, they were essentially working with a diluted version of something their indigenous counterparts had used as a serious, spiritual tool. Europe gets a new import. Tobacco arrived in Europe in the mid-16th century, carried back by Spanish and Portuguese explorers who had observed its use among indigenous peoples. Within decades, it was everywhere. Physicians promoted it as a miracle cure for headaches, colds, wounds, toothaches, bad breath, and about 40 other conditions. King James I of England, one of the few early modern European rulers with functioning critical thinking skills about this particular matter, wrote a treatise in 1604 called A Counterblast to Tobacco, calling it loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He was entirely correct and absolutely nobody listened. By the 17th century, tobacco had become one of the most economically significant commodities in the Atlantic world. The Virginia colony, which was struggling and near collapse, survived largely because John Rolfe began cultivating a milder strain of tobacco in 1612, which then sold extraordinarily well in England. The plantation system that would drive the transatlantic slave trade was built substantially on tobacco cultivation. A drug that indigenous peoples had used in careful ceremonial contexts became the economic engine of one of history's great atrocities. Coffee arrived in Europe around the same time, Also from outside the continent, spreading from the Arabian Peninsula through the Ottoman Empire into European coffeehouses, and coffee was also treated with deep suspicion by authorities. Ottoman Sultan Murad IV banned coffee in the 17th century. Charles II tried to suppress English coffeehouses in 1675, arguing they were seditious gathering places for troublemakers. He was also correct and also ignored. The pattern here is consistent. Every new psychoactive substance gets greeted with initial moral panic, extensive medicalization, widespread adoption, and then eventually either normalization or criminalization depending on who is using it and who stands to profit. The British Empire's most profitable product. In the 18th century, Britain had a trade problem with China. The British wanted enormous quantities of Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea. The Chinese, who had a sophisticated economy and manufacturing base, did not particularly want anything Britain was producing. The trade imbalance was severe. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for goods and getting nothing back. The solution the British East India Company arrived at was to begin exporting opium from its Indian territories into China, not because it was legal, ethically acceptable, or invited. The Qing dynasty had explicitly banned opium imports in 1729. The British kept exporting it anyway, using a system of private merchants and smugglers to maintain plausible deniability. Opium imports into China went from roughly 200 chests per year in 1729 to 1,000 per year by 1767, to 10,000 per year by 1830, to around 40,000 chests annually by 1838. Addiction rates soared. The Chinese government watched an entire class of its population become economically and physically dependent on a substance being pushed by a foreign power for profit. When the Chinese Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu destroyed 1,400 tons of British-owned opium in 1839, Britain went to war, not to stop the drug trade, to protect it. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 ended with China forced to open treaty ports, pay war reparations, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 ended with opium legalized in China entirely. Britain fought 2 wars to force a country to accept drug imports. This is not a controversial historical reading, this is what happened. And it is important context for any discussion about the moralizing that would come later, when Western nations started deciding which drugs were acceptable and which were not. The 19th century was basically a pharmaceutical free-for-all. In the early 19th century, European chemistry was advancing rapidly, and chemists began isolating active compounds from plants that had been used medicinally for centuries. In 1804, a young German pharmacist assistant named Friedrich Serturner extracted a compound from opium and named it morphine after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was roughly 10 times more potent than raw opium. Then in 1853, Alexander Wood invented the hypodermic needle. Within a decade, injectable morphine had become the standard treatment for pain in American and European hospitals. During the American Civil War, Union and Confederate surgeons used morphine as the primary pain management tool for battlefield injuries. When the war ended, an estimated 400,000 veterans were addicted. Physicians at the time called it the soldier's disease. The solution they proposed was to find a non-addictive alternative. In 1859, German chemist Albert Niemann isolated cocaine from coca leaves. It was initially celebrated as a miracle. Sigmund Freud published a glowing paper on its therapeutic benefits in 1884. Describing it as a stimulant, antidepressant, and aphrodisiac with no noted side effects. The Hay Fever Association endorsed it. Pope Leo XIII reportedly carried a flask of wine infused with coca leaves and awarded a gold medal to the pharmacist who made it. Coca-Cola, introduced in 1886, originally contained cocaine derived from coca leaf extract. The company removed it in 1903, but only after a campaign highlighting concerns about the drink being marketed specifically to Black Americans, which is a story about racism that somehow got folded into drug history. In 1898, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company synthesized a new compound from morphine through a process of acetylation. They named it heroin, a trade name derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, presumably reflecting how the drug made test subjects feel. Bayer marketed heroin aggressively as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. They also marketed it as a children's cough suppressant. Bayer was the same company that made aspirin, and for a while both products were sold in the same catalog. Please consult your physician before choosing between your headache remedy and your opioid. The patent medicine industry of the 19th century was staggering. Remedies containing morphine, laudanum, cocaine, and heroin were sold over the counter, without prescription, to anyone who could pay. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed for teething infants, contained morphine. Coca-Cola's slogan was, "the ideal brain tonic," when it still contained cocaine. If Victorian-era advertising seemed enthusiastic, it was because the products were genuinely doing something. Laudanum and the respectable addict. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was the most commonly prescribed medicine in the 19th century. Thomas Sydenham, the founder of English clinical medicine, called it one of the most valuable medicines in the world in the 17th century, and that opinion held for 200 years. The demographics of laudanum addiction in the 19th century are telling. American and British physicians prescribed it overwhelmingly to women, for conditions described as female troubles, nerves, hysteria, and virtually any complaint that was considered too feminine for serious medical investigation. Men with pain were given whiskey. Women with pain were given opium. The result was that laudanum addiction was heavily concentrated among middle and upper-class women, who were considered respectable. No one called them drug addicts. they were patients. This contrasts sharply with how opium was perceived when it was associated with Chinese immigrant communities in American cities, where it was smoked in dens rather than swallowed in tinctures. The same substance in different social contexts produced entirely different responses. One was medicine, one was moral catastrophe. The difference was not the drug. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote some of the most celebrated love poetry in the English language while dependent on laudanum. Samuel Taylor Coleridge composed Kubla Khan and claimed the whole poem arrived to him in an opium dream. Thomas de Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, which became a bestseller and treated addiction with unusual complexity. None of this made Victorian society reconsider its prescribing habits. It took roughly 80 years of mass addiction before things began to change. The turn toward criminalization. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was the first major federal attempt in the United States to regulate opiates and cocaine. It was technically a tax law, not a prohibition law, and initially it allowed physicians to continue prescribing narcotics to addicted patients. But subsequent regulatory interpretation and court rulings slowly transformed it into a de facto prohibition, with doctors prosecuted for prescribing to addicts and addicts reclassified from patients to criminals. The Volstead Act of 1919 brought alcohol prohibition, which lasted until 1933 and accomplished primarily the creation of organized crime in America, the corruption of municipal governments, and a period of exceptional creativity in cocktail culture as people found increasingly inventive ways to drink illegally. Alcohol was back, opiates and cocaine were not. The framing of drug prohibition was never purely about public health. Cannabis prohibition in the United States was driven significantly by a campaign led by Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who explicitly linked cannabis to jazz music, black communities, and Mexican immigrants in his press materials. His campaign described cannabis as causing murderous rage and sexual depravity among minority populations. This is documented. It is in his actual writings. The drug law that resulted from this campaign remained in place for decades. The story of where drugs are legal, where they are criminalized, and who gets punished for using them is not a story about pharmacology. It has never been a story about pharmacology. It is a story about power, money, race, and whose intoxication gets called medicine versus whose gets called crime. And that story, it turns out, is at least 10,000 years old, possibly older. The specific chemicals change. The argument about who gets to alter their consciousness, and under what conditions, and who profits from controlling the answer, has stayed remarkably consistent since the first Sumerian scribe decided to call a poppy the joy plant.